Hello and welcome to our webinar, Putting Artificial Intelligence to Work. I'm Paul Michelman, Editor-in-Chief of MIT Sloan Management Review, and I'll be your moderator today. This event will be recorded and will be available to all attendees approximately 3 to 4 business days after the end of the live event. Today's slides will also be made available. We welcome your questions for our speaker today. To submit questions, please enter them anytime in the questions module on the GoToWebinar control panel, or you can submit questions on Twitter using the hashtag #MITSMREvent. We'll answer as many questions as time permits. If you are having audio or other difficulties, please check the help link in the upper part of your console. Our speaker today is Thomas Davenport, President's Distinguished Professor of Information Technology and Management at Babson College, a research fellow at the MIT Initiative on the Digital Economy, a senior advisor to Deloitte Analytics, and author of the recent book, The AI Advantage: How to Put the Artificial Intelligence Revolution to Work. Our thanks go out to Bold360 by LogMeIn for their sponsorship of this webinar. Tom, we're looking forward to the presentation, so over to you.
Thanks, Paul. Great to be here. Please do submit some questions so Paul doesn't have to make them up. Looking forward to talking about this topic with you and to having a discussion near the end. This is me, this is Paul, in case you were wondering what we look like. So I'm going to talk about some of the ideas in the book and kind of in general where the world of artificial intelligence in enterprises stands now. Won't say too much about kind of consumer-related aspects of this technology. Won't be going into self-driving cars or home robots or anything like that. The focus is much more on how AI is being used in business with a focus on what's really possible today, not so much what's going to be possible, at some distant point in the future. So here's kind of an overview, and I'll go into each of these issues in greater detail. So I've done a number of surveys with Deloitte. Other consulting firms have done surveys. The number of large organizations that seem to be, moving ahead aggressively with AI, where you can find senior executive to talk intelligently about it. It seems to be about between 20 and 30%. I think that is increasing, but these are kind of the early adopters. There are a lot of different AI technologies, and I'll talk about that at some length. Some are being used more than others, certainly. Some are brand new, some are quite old. One of the challenges with this whole area is that it's pretty easy to do a pilot or a proof of concept or a prototype, but much harder to put these things into production deployment. So I think there's kind of an imbalance between the pilots and the production applications, and I'll talk about why. Companies, it turns out, have a lot of different objectives for what they want to do with AI, and the one that gets the most attention in the press, this idea of automating jobs, is among the least highly ranked of their objectives. However, I just finished with Deloitte a new survey of the state of AI. I think it's called the State of AI, Deloitte State of AI 2018. You can Google it and find it quite easily. There was one thing that really struck me in that survey, which was that people still said automation is a low priority, but they said 63% of them said, we're going to automate as many jobs as possible. And I said, whoa, I thought we were moving toward this future of augmentation rather than large-scale automation. So that certainly gave me pause. So I'll say a little bit more about that. In general, I think, in my book has the AI revolution in the subtitle. I do think that it will be a revolution over the long run, but in the short run, it's definitely an evolution. And The less ambitious, sort of low-hanging fruit applications seem to be working better than the highly ambitious moonshot. So I'll give some examples of that. Companies face challenges in implementation, particularly, embedding AI capabilities into their existing organizations. Data is a big challenge, getting data to train your system and so on. But a surprisingly high number of large organizations are setting up substantial AI management infrastructures. I'll say more about that later on. And due to all of these things, I think further growth seems inevitable. One of the things that really comes out from a couple of years of surveys that I've been involved in is that people who know a lot about this are very bullish, very positive on what it's doing for their organizations. They're already seeing benefits. So I think it's highly unlikely that, certainly there's a lot of hype, and maybe we'll enter the trough of disillusionment at some point, but I believe another AI winter is highly unlikely, given how much activity there is, both in terms of enterprises and venture capital and so on, and the pace at which things are improving. So a quick poll question. What's your company doing with artificial intelligence? And you have 5 choices here. Paul is going to tell you how to do it.
Yes, folks, you should see the poll screen pop up. So please take a moment to weigh in on this. And Tom, as we wait for the results, let's put your predictive analytics capabilities to the test. What do you expect to see?
Well, I did just say that between 20 and 30% are moving ahead aggressively. So I think that would be in the, 4th or 5th down categories, the good mix of pilots, prototypes, and production, and then very far along. I'm guessing, small businesses, a lot would say nothing yet, maybe 30% there, or just getting started maybe. So I predict a good mix across these categories.
All right, and here we go. So how does this play against what your expectations were?
Not quite as far along as I might have expected. So looks like, 68% are in the nothing or really just getting started. Only about 30% really moving ahead fairly aggressively. Well, that's not too different than what I suggested earlier. So plenty of running room, I guess, in this space, which is a good idea, I suppose. But just a little bit of a cautionary message. I'm in the middle of writing a piece with a guy I've co-authored with before, Vikram Mahidar of Genpact, and our argument is that being a fast follower is going to be difficult in this area, given all the learning that it takes and all the data that you have to gather and so on. So be careful about waiting too long. Okay, so what are the technologies that we're talking about here? I think, to talk about artificial intelligence technology is not really that accurate because there are a variety of these tools, and I tend to be fairly inclusive. Some people don't put machine learning in because it's been around for a while. Most people do include it, I would say. Some people don't put rule engines in because they think that's yesterday's news as far as AI is concerned, and it is, but as I'll show in a second, a lot of people are still using it. Robotic process automation is the least intelligent of the technologies on this list, but I do include it, 1, because it's very automation oriented, and 2, because it's increasingly being combined with other technologies like machine learning and deep learning for image recognition and so on. More and more, at some point, I think it won't make any sense to talk about these component technologies because they'll all be mixed up. And IBM Watson, which I don't think is at the forefront of anybody's mind now as a tool, but certainly was one of the first, it's really a collection of technologies, and I think we'll see more and more of these kind of platforms that do all sorts of things and can be combined in different ways. So there was a 2017 Deloitte survey that, as I said, the 2018 one is out, but I don't have the PowerPoint graphics yet from it, but I can tell you a little bit about it. Robotic process automation and statistical machine learning were the most popular in 2017. Those are still the most popular in 2018. They've both gone up a bit. Natural language processing has also gone up a bit. Rule-based systems have not gone up, but they haven't gone away. So that's, a lot of people thought that was how we did AI in the 80s and the 90s, but still quite useful to a lot of the companies I talked to for things like, insurance underwriting or credit card decision-making, so on. Deep learning has gone up further. Physical robots gone up further. I think the Deloitte survey actually put something like cognitive robots or intelligent robots in. I don't, those were judged quite pervasive, not as some of the other technologies, but I think they're mostly not out of the lab yet. And in general, I think there's a bit of excessive optimism about this, because there was also a question in the 2018 survey about affective computing, which comes out of mostly the MIT Media Lab, and there are a number of startups, but none of them are very big or their products very pervasive yet, and it's yet something like 30% said, oh yeah, we're doing affective computing. So I think you have to discount these a bit. People may be overly ambitious in describing what they're doing. But I know that this set of percentages is pretty accurate, because we last year took a collection of 152 cognitive technology or AI projects, most of which were being done, the great majority were being done by Deloitte, and tried to look at what they involved. And almost half were what Deloitte then called robotics and cognitive automation, reflecting the fact that robotic process automation is being mixed with other tools for typically, routine back office digital tasks, highly structured. A little more than a third were so-called cognitive insights, I call it analytics on steroids, highly granular statistical insights from structured data, typically using machine learning. And then about 16% were cognitive engagement, the idea that we're going to use chatbots, intelligent agents. I think our sponsors tool today, Bold 360, falls into that category, for interacting with either customers or, in many cases, employees, just because it's hard to do these things. Language is always difficult. You don't necessarily want to turn your customer entirely over to these things. So a lot of companies are trying it out on their employees. So I mentioned this idea of, what are the benefits that companies anticipate, and some are already getting some of these, but in terms of what they said they wanted to achieve, in the 2017 data, the biggest numbers were for products, existing products, making them better, both in terms of the number one choice, which is the black bar, and then the top three choices added up. Machine learning, I think, is probably most oriented to making better decisions or optimizing internal business operations. So those were a couple in the top four. Creating new products, surprisingly high. I noticed that in the 2018 survey, creating new products had actually fallen to much lower. So maybe not quite as much ambition in that regard, but enhancing existing products was still high. And then, interestingly enough, as I suggested earlier, reducing headcount through automation is near the bottom, or at the bottom, basically. So it's not a high-level objective on the part of companies to get rid of, human employees through AI. But as I said, there is that 63% figure that we need to keep thinking about, that you know, a number of companies said they did want to automate as many jobs as possible, or representatives of companies. So some quick examples of what companies are doing with this. I like the Vanguard example. It's sort of is illustrative of the kinds of things you can do with machine learning these days. And, you know, it's not rocket science. It's sort of cognitive or AI for basic investor advice. This is advice that Vanguard charges for. They had a set of services around asset management that they charge for, and I was a customer, so I was quite familiar with it, in addition to doing some research with them. One day they called me and said, you know, you've always been complaining that we take our recommendations for you and just read them to you, and you said, you know, can I read them directly myself? Well, guess what? You're going to be able to do that now, and we're going to charge you half the price. We're going to reduce your fees from 60 basis points to 30 basis points, and do automated things like portfolio rebalancing and tax loss harvesting, and tell you whether you're going to outlive your income or not before you die. So, you know, these are kind of the basic sorts of tasks that organizations do in these kind of robo-advice, as they're called, situations. The Vanguard example of this, and many investment firms offer this capability now, maybe a little less sophisticated than some. Morgan Stanley, for example, recommends individual stocks with this, but does charge more for it. But the Vanguard one is the most successful in the United States and the world, I think, with over $110 billion now under management, growing more rapidly than anybody else. And I think a big key to their success all along was to say, we still are going to allow you to talk to a human. And so you may say, well, with the machines doing all that, what's left for the human? And you know, one of my Babson students once said to me, he worked for Fidelity, and he said, you know, Fidelity has not been into this quite as much as Vanguard, but he said, I'm feeling the footsteps, I'm hearing the footsteps, you know, my conversations with clients are getting more scripted, you know, more of these recommendations are made automatically. He said, I think I'm going to move into financial psychiatry, is a term I love. Basically, he's saying, I'm going to help people make more rational decisions. You know, the recommendations may be to, you know, don't buy high and sell low, which unfortunately many investors do, but people often panic, and, you know, I'll try to talk them down, or try to reconcile the diverse investing perspectives of husbands and wives, which I think does require a pretty high level of psychiatry. Anyway, this has been a very successful offering. NASA is, I think, a fun example, because mostly because of what the project manager of this work on robotic process automation told me. He said, you know, Tom, this is not rocket science, and we should know. So it's a pretty typical use of RPA for back office financial processes. They are not trying to get rid of people. They have limited budgets, though, for expansion, and you know, we can't hire people. We need to hire some bots. They're trying to move over time to more what they call cognitive bots, smarter ones that have better decision-making capabilities. And at the same time, NASA is pursuing some kind of rocket science-like objectives with AI, working with firms like Google and Intel and so on for things like celestial navigation with AI. And then Pfizer is an interesting illustration. I think of one of the more aggressive postures toward AI in the pharmaceutical industry. Whole variety of projects. Every time I saw someone from Pfizer last week, and he said, yeah, now we're up to about 150 projects. It had been 100 before that. I think in my book I might have said 60, or maybe I got 100 in there before it was published. But you know, constantly adding them. for a whole variety of purposes. I'm trying to figure out, which physicians are the most effective prescribers of their drugs, or what's going to identify the, patients who adhere to treatment regimens and things like vaccines. They did have one sort of moonshot-ish project to develop drugs better. That one used Watson, although I was told they are cooling on the idea of using Watson for that. So I think it's still underway. However, the project is still underway. Anyway, a lot of different projects, some in production. Most of them you might say are, evolutionary rather than revolutionary at this point. And I went recently to a conference at Harvard Medical School on AI and in life science and pharmaceuticals, and thought it was interesting. No mentions of Watson except as kind of a cautionary note, and B, a lot of activity, mostly on the part of startups. Big companies like Pfizer are a little less aggressive and kind of holding back, even though Pfizer is obviously doing a lot, at least in the drug development area. Most of that action seems to be in startups. Okay, so you may say, okay, just how ambitious should I be with this stuff? AI is talked about all the time as something that can transform organizations. In the Deloitte survey, I forget the exact numbers, but high percentages of companies said, yeah, it's going to transform our company and our industry within 3 years. Interestingly, in the 2018 survey, there was a little more caution about how rapidly that's going to happen. Substantially smaller numbers said that they'd be transforming within a couple of years. But you may have heard about this MD Anderson project. It's become somewhat notorious. Cancer Center down in Houston does great work. I think somebody from there won the Nobel Prize this year. They were really the second cancer center to embark upon a big Watson project. The first was Memorial Sloan Kettering. Memorial Sloan Kettering was, I think, appropriately quite cautious in talking about what they were doing and how easily it would, make major improvements in cancer treatment. But MD Anderson was not so cautious, and they really, did a lot with their press releases and articles that newspapers wrote. You kind of got the feeling they'd already cured cancer, as some people had suggested to me. This project was driven by the CEO. His wife was the project manager. She's obviously a qualified person. She's a well-known physician at MD Anderson. $62 million raised and spent. Some of the money raised from a shadowy Indonesian figure named Zhou Lo. It contributed 50 million of the money and is now on the run from the global financial police. As I say, very highly visible in the media. So after, I think, 4 years or so, the University of Texas auditors, who University of Texas owns MD Anderson, said, what's going on with that project? We spent 62 million, but no patients have been treated, no integration whatsoever with their electronic medical health record system. They said, we're going to put the kibosh on this project, put on indefinite hold. And, that was a couple of years ago. Nothing happened since. However, it's important to point out that at the same time at MD Anderson, there were some other projects going on, these overseen by the Chief Information Officer, that were pretty successful. Used another technology from a company called Cognitive Scale, doing things like creating a care concierge, help patient families figure out where their family should stay and have dinner and so on while they had a patient in the hospital, or identifying patients who were likely to need help with their bills early on so they could start that process earlier. Even perhaps the most prosaic, but can certainly be useful application of AI, helping with IT problems. A lot of companies are doing that, it turns out. And all of those worked quite well. So I think it's illustrative of the fact that AI is probably better suited in many ways now for doing these small things well, rather than highly ambitious projects. And in my book, I talk about some other examples, a detailed case study at DBS Bank in Singapore, where they wanted to use, again, Watson for developing a robo-advisor that would recommend stocks, and it turns out, it didn't work as well as their best human experts. They also had some low-hanging fruit projects that were working quite well. You say, well, maybe it's just these companies aren't quite technically sophisticated enough. So I don't know, some of you heard of Amazon.com? I think you would probably all agree that they're pretty technically sophisticated. In fact, the last time I checked, I think it was for my book, they had something like 560 openings for PhD level AI engineers. That's just openings. God knows how many they actually employ. So Amazon certainly has some moonshots underway. Some of you may have been to the Amazon Go store in Seattle, which I recently visited. Certainly the idea of going in and taking groceries off a shelf, or it's really more of a convenience store, taking convenience level groceries off a shelf, putting them in your little basket, and then carrying them out without paying, only to be greeted a few minutes later with a receipt on your smartphone. That's kind of a moonshot. It was not easy to do. They had some false starts. Some people were able to steal stuff early on, but they seem to have worked that out. The idea of delivering items by drone is certainly a highly aggressive one that who knows when and if that will ever happen. But for a company like Amazon, you'd say they should have some highly aggressive projects. But the bulk of what they do is on the right in this slide. Things like better demand forecasting, better ranking of products when you search, fraud detection, merchandising decisions, et cetera. So Jeff Bezos said in his 2017 letter to shareholders, much of the impact of what we do with machine learning will be to quietly but meaningfully improve core operations. And I think if that's true for Amazon, I suspect it should probably be true for the vast bulk of organizations in this world who don't have quite the technical capabilities that Amazon does. Okay, so we get to this question that comes up all the time. Are knowledge workers going to be automated? I did write a book, and I think even did a MIT Sloan Management Review webcast about this a couple of years ago. It's a book called Only Humans Need Apply, so I'll go fairly quickly through it. But the issue is that these systems are coming now not for manual labor jobs or administrative jobs. Much of those have already been automated, but for knowledge work jobs. And I suspect the vast bulk of you listening today are knowledge workers, and you are right to be somewhat concerned about this issue, particularly when I say 63% of managers say, yeah, we're going to automate as many jobs as possible. So are knowledge workers next to go on the chopping block of history? Well, I think it's not a terribly satisfactory answer, but I'll have to say yes and no to this one. I think one of the things that makes moonshots difficult for AI is that it doesn't generally do entire jobs, certainly doesn't do entire business processes. It performs tasks. And so yes, a number of knowledge work tasks will be automated, already have been in many cases. Some knowledge workers, as a result, I think will lose their jobs. We'll probably have depressed hiring in some professions, maybe in law. There have already been some issues in law firms with regard particularly to commercial litigation and the idea of kind of reading through voluminous amounts of correspondence within a company. Did anybody say something illegal there? Whatever. Machines can do that quite well now, and it's pretty much taken it out of the hands of $300 an hour law firm employees. But there will, of course, be a lot of jobs working alongside these machines. Nobody knows how many. You should not trust anything that you you read about 47% of US jobs are going to be automated or whatever. Nobody really knows. We could really use some productivity from these tools. We haven't had any productivity gains recently in our country or in most industrialized countries. That could fund a lot of retraining, redeployment, guaranteed basic incomes, all sorts of things. I don't know how likely that is, but I think it's really important not to be complacent about this. And that's my fundamental message. Nobody knows exactly, but to say this is not going to happen to me, I think is a very bad idea. So just as an illustration of that, these are 10 knowledge work jobs with tasks that are either already automated in many cases or highly automatable. It's horrible that even some of the things that sacred profession of teacher or professor does, machines can do as well, or better in some cases, particularly knowing whether somebody's learning something in more or less real time. This adaptive learning is much better done by machines. I mentioned lawyers, accountants, Deloitte and most of the other big law firms, big accounting firms these days are trying to figure out how can we automate aspects of audits, and certainly tax work has already gone in that direction. In various medical professions, radiology, pathology, we hear all the time that machines are getting good at identifying potentially cancerous lesions. The AP writes a ton of stories with automation. Much of marketing is getting automated. Financial advice, as I mentioned, asset management in financial services, trading is probably almost completely automated. Now you always see these people on the New York Stock Exchange on TV, but they're not doing much anymore. It's mostly for TV purposes that they're there. All the trading happens in a server farm off in New Jersey. Programming, many people believe will have aspects of it like code generation automated, and even the profession that everybody gravitates toward these days. I wrote an article a few years ago calling this the sexiest job of the 21st century. Data scientists are at risk because of automated machine learning that does many of the tasks that used to require a sophisticated data scientist, now can be done by machine. So, and it turns out the biggest objectors to automated machine learning are data scientists. And I say, it's not sexy to resist new technology, but even they have a hard time getting used to that idea. So there are more jobs, there are more tasks, but most of us do more than one task in our jobs. And I think for the most part, we're going to be okay for the foreseeable future. In general, I've been a pretty strong advocate of augmentation. That's what this book, Only Humans Need Apply, with Julia Kirby was about. This idea behind freestyle chess that smart humans and smart machines working together can do the best kind of work. Automation is kind of a race to the bottom in that it lowers your costs, but it lowers everybody's costs and then everybody's margins. Makes it typically more difficult to innovate when you've automated something, you've kind of programmed it in. Obviously, if you announce that you're automating lots of jobs, then your employees will be somewhat less likely to help you out in that process. So if you want employee participation, I think you'll be far wiser to announce, yeah, we're going to be embarking upon some augmentation-oriented initiatives here. But as I said, 63% of managers say they are looking forward to lots of automation. So nobody knows exactly where this is going to fall out. I think the only real answer, I won't go into detail on this because, as I say, it's in a book. I did a webcast a couple of years ago. I'm sure you all remember all about it. But what Julia and I did in that book was really to define 5 ways that people can add value to smart machines. Maybe the step-in role where you work with them closely as a colleague, know its strengths and weaknesses, and and maybe, improve its performance occasionally. It picks up the ball when you screw up, you pick up the ball when it screws up. The step up role is kind of the hedge fund manager equivalent, where the trading may be done by machine, but somebody's got to say, do I need more automation, less automation, different automation, and so on, kind of a managerial role. Stepping aside is doing things that machines aren't very good at, maybe highly empathetic or creative roles. Stepping narrowly is doing something that is potentially automatable, but such a small niche that nobody would find it economical to do so. And then finally, those sort of what we call stepping forward, where you're developing these capabilities. So if you add all these things up, I think there are going to be lots and lots of jobs. Some of them will be new, some of them will be old but modified, but nobody knows exactly how many. Okay, so what do people think about this issue? When we surveyed managers, they tended to say, not so worried about large-scale automation, at least in the short run. That's the top bar, the black bars. So not that many people expecting large-scale automation in 3 years, somewhat more in 5, and somewhat more in 10. The off-white bar is the augmentation one, and that's the biggest in 3 years, and still pretty substantial, tied for first, I guess, in 10 years, where people and machines are going to work alongside each other. I guess the really encouraging news is that the darker blue bar near the bottom is new jobs, and 18% in 3 years, 28% in 10 years expect that there will be a lot of those. So, and you may have seen there was a World Economic Forum study recently, one of, I don't know, about 20 I've seen, that said, yeah, we're going to lose, I don't know, 250 million jobs, but gain 300 million jobs or something like that. As I said, the numbers are not precise, and we shouldn't really believe them, but there is some optimism out there about the new jobs issue. And I suppose that even the 63% of managers in the 2018 survey who said they want to automate a lot of jobs could still be expecting some new jobs to emerge. So we have another polling question. Paul, you want to?
Yeah. So folks, you should see the poll on your screen right now. So please weigh in, and Tom, let's do the same routine as with the first poll. Where do you see these results shaking out?
I would pick the fourth response down as being the most common. Both some automation and some augmentation are likely. I think number 2, AI will have no impact, is a bit unrealistic. Minor job loss through automation may be fairly popular response, but maybe that 63% who voted in the other survey I mentioned for large-scale automation will weigh in here and say the last one, we're headed for large-scale job loss.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you buy into some of the news coverage, the particularly hyped news coverage, you might believe in 5, but one wonders if people's rational selves will win out, especially the extremely sophisticated and intelligent people in our crowd today.
Of course.
So we should have those results. There you go. Look at that. Interesting.
That's good. Very high percentage saying, some automation, some augmentation, very low, only 5% saying large-scale job loss, about the same saying no impact at all. The agnostics saying, hey, it's too far in the future to really venture even a guess. But this kind of reflects my view, which is that augmentation had been kind of becoming a bit of a consensus, but that's why I was so shocked by that 63% funding I mentioned earlier. Okay, so I mentioned challenges. Biggest one, this was also big in 2018, difficult difficulty integrating cognitive projects with existing process and systems. It's one of the reasons why more and more companies are saying, I'm going to let my existing vendors of transaction systems, ERP, maybe it's SAP or Oracle, they're announcing some AI capabilities. Maybe it's Salesforce.com for CRM. They're now, they have these Einstein things. I'm going to buy it from my vendor that solves A, the integration problem, and B, the data problem, since the data is already in those systems in many cases. But unless you do that, it's can be quite challenging. Some people said the technology and expertise were too expensive. I think this third one is a very important one. Managers don't understand cognitive technologies and how they work. And I think if you're going to be making intelligent decisions, it's important to try to educate the people within your company, if you have any responsibility for this, on how all this stuff works. Interestingly enough, 18% said the technologies had been oversold in the marketplace, but in another question, many more people said they thought AI was underhyped rather than overhyped. So it might be hard to imagine a lot more hype, but that's what they said. So I mentioned these infrastructures are being created quite rapidly. So yeah, another reason not to go slowly here, but more than half said they have a process for moving prototypes into production. This is 2018 data, by the way. 52% have an implementation roadmap for AI. 45% have appointed champions. 43% have preferred vendors. 37% have a center of excellence for AI, which I knew there were some of. I was surprised there were quite that many. And 37% said they have a strategy in place. So again, I think there may be a little bit of inflation here, or excess optimism about what companies are doing, but it does suggest that there's some pretty rapid progress. So just to sum up, what I think you should do if you want to be a cognitive company or AI first company or whatever, not that many of you said you were that already, but presumably some are moving in that direction, and I talk to one or two a week that say they're in that category. Pilots are great, but make sure you have a pipeline for them to get into production. Not all of them, but at least some of them. Small steps are good, but I think having a bold objective is also a way to go. So maybe you can combine multiple smaller projects into something broader. A lot of low-hanging fruit projects maybe adding up to a moonshot. Augmentation, I think, is generally the way to go here, and certainly if you want to get people to go on the route with you. We're going to have to start thinking quite carefully about who does what here. What can machines do well? What can humans do well? So it's another opportunity to redesign our processes. It's going to take employees some time, so I think we need to start helping them think about what the possibilities might be for jobs in the future and how to transition to them. We're now, I think, more and more sensitive to the ethical issues here, so it's not too early to put an ethical framework in place. And I think in the 2018 survey, about 37% said they thought AI raised enough ethical issues so that you ought to be treating it in that context. And then somebody ought to be put in charge of this if you're going to move ahead. And I think a lot of companies that have these cognitive centers of excellence or whatever have started to do that. So with that, I'm happy to take your questions. I don't know if you've gotten any yet, Paul.
Tom, we have more than a few, and so let me begin by thanking the audience for an outstanding and diverse set of questions, and let's see how many we can get to. Why don't we begin with the question of historical context? Can you put AI in a context for us? What, in terms of its potential for disruption, its potential for kind of fundamental transformation in the enterprise, what is a historical precedent? Is there one?
A historical precedent with AI or with other technologies?
With other technologies, I think.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think it's quite similar in a lot of ways to, some people have compared it to electricity. I wasn't around when that really started to take over companies, but it does remind me a lot of what happened with the internet and electronic commerce and so on. A lot of hype, but I think many would say that much of the hype has come true. It took a while, longer than anybody really anticipated. The technologies at first were not terribly mature, particularly if you go all the way back to TCP/IP. You could argue that it took 20 years or so for that to fully mature. So I would say that was a technology that has been revolutionary in the long run and evolutionary in the short run, the same way I think AI will be, or already has been to some degree.
Thanks. So with those kind of stakes, how serious is the knowledge gap in organizations between the tech side and particularly senior management on the business side? Presumably, if AI has, certainly in the long term, major ramifications for business strategy, are executives equipped to actually understand what it can do?
I think for the most part, no. And there is, as with some previous technologies, there is, the phenomenon of people CEOs hearing from their boards, oh, you ought to do something with Watson, or oh, you got to get into AI, and not really knowing what to do, and kind of very mindlessly saying, get something going so I can tell my board that I'm doing it, or whatever. But it's not easy to understand the sort of different technologies, how they relate to different use cases, what kind of ambition is appropriate and what parts of your business, where are the most important areas of the business for the application of this stuff. So I do think that it requires a concerted effort, and let's just say I don't hear too many examples of companies that have embarked upon, formal educational initiatives for senior executives. I think there should be a lot more. And you may recall Paul, you're not as old as I am, but in the e-commerce days, you did have a number of cases where companies would, they would appoint youth ambassadors, people who understood e-commerce, to mentor senior executives and so on, which I thought may have been a little naive, but it's certainly well-intentioned idea. You don't hear nearly as much about that, maybe because there aren't that many young people who understand this technology too. I mean, the big problem is not only do we not have very many people who are highly expert in AI, we don't even have very many faculty who can teach it. And most of the technical faculty have been sucked up by Google and Facebook and the various autonomous vehicle companies and so on. So there's a real brain drain from universities in terms of who can teach this stuff to the next generation of potential AI experts.
Well, right. So that actually dovetails nicely into a question that several people asked in different ways, and frankly is on my mind as the father of a college freshman. If I'm interested in AI, right? I'm 18 years old. I'm 19 years old. What does the path look like, especially given the lack, presumably what you're talking about, lack of expertise within the academy on this topic? How do you train yourself up?
Well, I mean, you may not find a huge amount of it at your university, but there are, since the last generation of people being highly enthused about technology, we have these new things called MOOCs. So there are various online education options. Maybe Paul, your child can take fewer high-priced courses from your university and take a cheap MOOC and get some credit. Your tuition bill may not be quite as high. I doubt that, by the way, but that is a good option, I think. And there's no shortage of stuff that you can read about this. But I think right now, if you're really motivated to become an AI expert, you will have to embark upon some self-education, some autodidactic activity.
Got it. Thanks. So a couple of questions about AI and innovation. What are you seeing with kind of the use of AI within the innovation function?
Well, as I haven't seen a huge number of detailed examples, but as I look at these surveys, a lot of people trying to add AI to existing products and services. Some examples of that, a lot of industrial companies are saying, okay, we're going to put sensors in our various industrial devices, and then we're going to have a digital twin that keeps track of all the data coming from them and can identify anomalies and patterns and so on, and let us do predictive maintenance and figure out what's going on before it happens. Certainly in financial services, you have attempts to add AI to investing advice, to customer interaction. So, I think most of the pure innovation-oriented functions, the R&D-oriented functions, may not, have AI experts in them, but you have companies like Procter & Gamble. The work on AI is overseen by a grouping of the IT function and the more emerging technologies oriented people in that, and the R&D group. And they've done interesting things like create the Olay skin analyzer, which tells women presumably to take a selfie of their faces, and it will tell you through the use of deep learning analysis, deep learning models, it will tell you the age, the actual age of your face. My wife said, no way do I want to know that. And we'll tell you which Olay cosmetics could, restore the damage or make you look better.
Tom, where are we seeing AI in the augmentation role at play today? Are there companies or industries that are more advanced?
I think it's pretty pervasive, frankly. I hear about it a lot in healthcare, where I was talking recently to a company called Flatiron Health, now owned by Roche, that is doing some really sophisticated work in terms of cancer treatment, using all sorts of data to improve community level cancer care. And they have a job that they call abstractor, which their role is to take unstructured information out of electronic health records, things like physicians' notes and so on. And what they have concluded is, you could think about using AI to do all that analysis and extract the structured information value without human intervention. But they said, no, instead, what we're going to try to do is improve the productivity of that role. And I think that's a really good idea. And, you see it at a very prosaic level. Every time I send an email now, I get suggestions from Gmail about how to finish that sentence or how to respond to that particular message. That's not eliminating my role as an emailer. It's just improving my productivity. So I think I see augmentation all over the place. And the same thing I was suggesting about in the robo-advice area, the great majority of investment companies that offer some automated help in investing also make it possible for you to talk to humans, usually without any additional cost.
Tom, if all organizations have the same opportunities with AI, first through, from efficiency through to discovering wholly new opportunities to pursue, are we looking at an AI arms race, and could that lead us to more winner-take-all markets?
I think that probably it does have some winner-take-all effects. Just in part because, the bigger, more technologically aggressive companies tend to be the ones who are embarking on AI journeys, more rapidly, and who are setting up these infrastructures, and who have 150 projects and so on. Now, it's interesting. You see, I think both in fintech and in biotech, these emerging startups for curing cancer with AI, or providing, effective investment advice through AI. The most pervasive kind of end-to-end approaches to use AI to develop new drugs or develop better investing advice or whatever are in the startups. The big companies tend to be more conservative. It'll be interesting to see, will they end up acquiring those startups, which you already see happening in the fintech space. In pharma and life sciences, you tend to see a lot of partnerships. Although somebody complained at this conference I attended recently that the big pharma companies are not really driving the agenda among the startups. It's outside investors, venture capital and so on, that are driving the agenda. And interestingly enough, Chinese firms are investing quite heavily in US-based startups for life sciences. So China, of course, is kind of a wild card. Lots and lots of government level investment in this space. I think the US is still leading from a private sector perspective in AI, but way more government investment. I mean, Shanghai alone is investing more in AI than the entire United States government. I think it's just incredible.
Tom, I think we probably have time for two more. You just listed a number of industries where the AI platform is definitely burning. Are there some industries that can relax for the moment, or is this completely pervasive?
Well, there's certainly those that are less aggressive. I mean, we've been hearing about smart grids and utilities for a long time, but so far utilities have been pretty conservative in the use of AI, as well as a whole variety of other technologies. Public sector, relatively low, as you might expect. Healthcare, there's a lot happening, but it's going to take a long time to make it into day-to-day clinical practice, for better or worse. Those, I think, would be some of the generally slower industries to adopt.
Let's talk about rational versus ethical behavior in AI and in AI programming. Is it reasonable to expect, now we may not be talking about short term here, maybe we're talking about medium or long term, but is it reasonable to expect AI to be able to balance rational and ethical behavior?
Well, I don't know, that's a pretty tall order. For it to do rational behavior, I guess that means we need to understand it. And that is, of course, a big problem with a lot of AI. The models are so complex and so opaque that we can't really know how it makes its decisions. So could we call it rational if we can't understand it? Maybe that's more of a philosophical debate than anything else. But I do think that opacity is going to hinder a lot of industries where AI might be highly regulated, financial services and healthcare, for example. The ethical, I think, again, we probably need to know how it works in order to know whether it's ethical or not. And there's a lot of attention, I wrote about it, as you know, recently in Sloan Management Review with a Deloitte co-author. We don't really know how ethical a lot of these decisions are that AI makes, and most companies are beginning to worry about things like algorithmic bias. That was true with conventional analytics, but it's far more true with AI. So a lot of work to do there, I think.
So let's bring it down. We'll bring it down to earth for one final question. This is particularly for people in our audience who are urging their organizations forward, perhaps not with a great deal of success so far. What is that one thing any organization can do to dip their toe in the water just to get going?
Conventional machine learning is not that hard. It's kind of like you do a regression equation and then you score all of your customers on, how likely they are to buy your product or something like that. It's been around for 20 or 30 years. You can do it with a lot of even free open source software. So there's really no excuse not to at least be doing some of that type of machine learning within your organization. And if you have any kind of analytical capabilities at all, you should be able to pull it off quite successfully.
Great. Thanks, Tom. So on that practical and optimistic note, I say to you, thank you very much. This has been a terrific program. And that wraps up our session for today, folks. Over the next few days, please look for a feedback survey we'll be sending you via email. We would greatly appreciate hearing your thoughts and opinions on today's program. A reminder that a recording of this program, along with the slides, will be available within 3 to 4 business days. And that concludes our program. Thank you for attending. Thank you, Tom Davenport, and thank you to our sponsor, Bold 360 by LogMeIn.